The folding chairs were full of families, balloons tied to the backs, phones already up to film the puppies-turned-soldiers about to graduate. And down the side aisle alone came an old man in a Marine Corps cap so faded the eagle had nearly worn away, lowering himself one careful inch at a time into the last chair in the back row, where he thought no one would notice him. No one had come with him. No one had saved him a seat. But as he settled, something happened that made the handler stop mid-sentence. Every dog in the graduating class, 8 trained German shepherds sitting in a disciplined line at the front, turned their heads at once, away from their handlers, away from the crowd, toward the old man in the back. 8 pairs of ears went up, and one young handler, a man near the front who had served and knew what that meant, went very still and said nothing yet. He had learned a long time ago that the first thing you do is watch, and that when every dog in the room turns the same way, you find out why. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moves you, please subscribe and stay until the very end. What you're about to hear will restore your faith in the people who are still out there, quietly paying attention. Let's see how far this journey takes us together. His name was Cole Hayes, and he was 42 years old. Built broad through the shoulders and chest the way men stay built when discipline has long outlived the reason for it. His dark hair had gone gray at the temples, cropped close out of habit. A thin scar traced the line of his jaw and disappeared under his collar, the kind of mark a man stops explaining after the 10th time. But it was the eyes people noticed and then looked away from, cold gray, restless. The eyes of someone who never truly stopped scanning rooms, exits, and the hands of strangers without asking permission, and then, having measured, let you be. He moved through the world with the permanent stillness of a man who had nothing left to prove. Not aggression, its opposite. He was not unfriendly by nature. Life had simply sanded down the parts of him that used to speak first. He watched more than he talked, and when he finally did move, he moved all at once, the way still water becomes a flood. Helmand had taken friends. The years after had taken the illusion that peace meant quiet. Now Cole lived in the narrow space between discipline and distance, in a small town in the Virginia Piedmont where nobody knew his name, which was exactly how he'd wanted it. Cole had served 13 years in the Marine Corps, the last 8, as a military working dog handler with 2 tours in Helmand Province and 1 in Anbar. He'd left after a roadside blast outside Marja killed the sergeant beside him and put enough metal in his hip that the surgeon spent 5 hours deciding what to leave. The medical discharge had come with a folded flag for another man's mother and a limp that woke him on cold mornings. He had carried more men than he could comfortably count, and he had come home to a country that thanked him in airports and forgot him on every road, in between. What he carried was simple and heavy. He had spent 13 years standing between people who couldn't protect themselves and whatever wanted to hurt them. And then the Corps had told him he was finished, and he had never worked out what a man like him was supposed to do with a life that no longer needed him. So he'd taken work as a trainer at the regional K9 academy that turned out service and working dogs, and trained the next generation of dogs to do the job he could no longer do himself, because at least a man could finish that. He was at the front of the graduation that morning as the lead handler, proud of the 8 dogs in the line, expecting an ordinary ceremony, the way he expected nothing remarkable from most mornings. The dog who would matter most in this story was the lead dog of the graduating class, named Titan. He was 2 years old at graduation, but built already like the older dogs Cole had known in war. 90 pounds of black and rich amber, his coat darkened along the spine and across both ears. He had no combat scar, being young and new, but he had the bearing of one, and he moved with the clean, controlled confidence of a trained canine who had already learned the difference between noise and threat, and he wasted nothing, no motion, no sound, no attention that wasn't earned. He was the best dog Cole had trained since leaving the Corps, the steadiest, the one with something in him Cole couldn't quite name. What Cole did not yet know, what would come clear over the hours and days that followed, was why Titan and all 7 of his classmates had broken their training discipline in the same instant to turn toward one frail old man in the back of the room. Dogs do not do that for nothing. These dogs had been trained for months not to break focus for a crowd, a balloon, a dropped chair. And every one of them had turned, as if to a command no human in the room had given, toward the worn Marine Corps cap in the last row. The place was a regional working dog academy outside a town called Cedar Grove, In the rolling Virginia Piedmont, where the horse farms ran behind white fences and the Blue Ridge sat blue and low on the western horizon. That morning the spring sun came warm and gold through the high windows of the training hall, the floor scrubbed clean, the families bright and chattering in their folding chairs, the whole room full of the particular joy of a graduation, beginnings, not endings. It was a good place doing good work. And yet Cole had learned that even in the brightest rooms, there is sometimes one person sitting alone in the back carrying a grief or an injustice that the celebration has no idea is among them, and that the dogs who do not celebrate and do not look away are often the first to know. There was no cruel man at the center of this story, no villain with a name on a building. The thing that had wronged the old man in the back was quieter and more common than cruelty. It was forgetting. It was a country and a town and a family that had let an 87-year-old veteran slip into total isolation. A man who had given the academy something priceless decades ago and been forgotten by it, who had outlived everyone who knew his name, who had seen the flyer for the public graduation and put on his good cap and come alone, on 2 buses, because he could not stay away from the dogs even though no one had thought to invite him. The injustice was the slow erasure of a man who deserved to be remembered, and it had a remedy that did not require an arrest, only that someone, finally, turn around and see him the way the dogs already had. What people in Cedar Grove did not know was that the academy they were so proud of had been founded in part on the work of a man almost no one there still remembered. What they did not know was that the very bloodline of the dogs graduating that day, the steadiness, the temperament, the thing Cole couldn't name in Titan, traced back through decades of breeding and training to the methods and the original dogs of a Marine who had pioneered war dog training in his own service and brought that knowledge home. The dogs had not turned toward a stranger. In a way written into their blood and their training lineage, they had turned toward the source, toward the scent and the bearing and the quiet authority of the man their whole line had in the deepest sense come from. The old veteran was named Walter Briggs, 87 years old, and he wore his age and his isolation with a dignity that made the empty chair beside him an ache to look at. He had been a Marine in Korea and after, a dog handler, then a trainer, one of the men who had built the American military working dog program in its early hard years, who had trained dogs that saved Marines on patrol and then spent a long civilian life passing that craft on, including decades ago, to the founders of this very academy. His wife was long gone. He'd had no children. The men he'd served with and trained beside had died one by one until the phone stopped ringing entirely. He did not complain. He had seen the public notice for the graduation in the local paper, and the pull of it, the dogs, the work, the only world that had ever truly been his, had been stronger than his pride. And so he had come alone, dressed with care, asking nothing, hoping only to sit in the back and watch the dogs and remember who he had been. He carried himself with dignity first. He'd pressed his old shirt and worn his good cap and made the long bus trip on aching legs to sit in a back row chair. He did not wave or speak or try to be noticed. The contrast was the whole quiet injustice in a single image. A man who had helped build the very thing being celebrated, who ran in the blood of every dog in that line, sitting alone and unremarked in the back row, while a room full of people who owed him more than they knew filmed dogs he had, in the truest sense, helped create. Cole saw the dogs turn first, all 8 as one, a thing he had never seen and could not explain. Then he followed their 8-fold stare to the old man in the back, and saw the faded eagle globe and anchor on the cap, and the careful way the man held himself and the empty chairs all around him. And he saw Titan, his steadiest dog, strain at the line with a low sound that was not alarm but something almost like longing. Cole went very quiet, the way he used to go quiet right before everything happened at once, though this was not danger, but something he didn't yet have a word for. He did not call the dogs back to order. Instead, on an instinct he trusted more than protocol, he gave Titan a quiet release, and the young dog crossed the length of the hall, past the crowd, past the balloons, and went straight to Walter Briggs and sat at his feet and laid his head against the old man's knee. And one by one the other 7 followed, until 8 graduating war dogs lay in a half circle around a forgotten old Marine in the back of the room, and the families lowered their phones, and the hall went silent. The mystery of it did not let go of Cole, because men like Cole do not let a thing like that pass unexplained. Over the hours and days that followed, Cole learned the shape of it. He sat with Walter Briggs after the ceremony, the old man's eyes wet, his hands buried in Titan's fur, and he listened. And then he went into the Academy's own records, the dusty founding history almost no one had read, and he traced it. He learned that Walter Briggs's name was in the Academy's origin, that the founders had trained under him, that the breeding lines ran back to dogs Walter had brought home and developed, that the methods Cole himself used every day had Walter's fingerprints on them. He learned that the man who had given all of this its start had, somewhere in the decades of the Academy's growth and success, simply been forgotten, dropped from the story, uninvited, unremembered, living alone 3 towns over on a thin pension while the thing he'd built thrived without his name. The ally arrived in the form of the Academy's oldest staff member, a woman named Carol, who ran the records office and had been there longer than anyone, and who, when Cole came asking, went pale and then ashamed. "Briggs," she said softly. "Lord Walter Briggs, he trained the founders. I was new, I remember the name on the old papers, he stopped coming, and then everyone who knew him retired or passed, and we forgot him." She had the documents, the founding records, the training lineage, the dedication in the Academy's first charter to the man who'd taught its founders everything. She had simply never had reason to pull them until a room full of dogs forced the question. Titan would not be parted from Walter now. The young lead dog had chosen, the way these dogs do, and the Academy, hearing the whole story, did not have the heart or the right to separate them. Cole began driving Walter out to the Academy, and Titan would meet the old man at the door every time, and the other dogs would gather. And for the first time in longer than he could say, Walter Briggs was not alone in the only world that had ever been his. Cole let it be so. The man the records had forgotten, the dogs had remembered in their blood. Cole made his case to the Academy's director and laid it out flat. Who Walter Briggs was, what he had given, how completely he had been forgotten, and what was owed. He didn't raise his voice. He'd been trained to brief command, and he briefed it. "You feel strongly about this," the director said. "Seen enough good men forgotten," Cole said. "But there was a complication, the way there often is, and it came in the form of a man named Wade Vance, the Academy's business director, who had spent years quietly rebranding the Academy's history around its current donors and his own tenure, and who did not want an 87-year-old founder suddenly surfacing to complicate the polished origin story he sold to funders. Vance moved, the way men protecting a narrative do. He suggested Walter's claims were the exaggerations of a confused old man, that the records were ambiguous, that dredging up some forgotten trainer would only muddy the Academy's brand on the eve of a major fundraising campaign, and he moved to keep Walter quietly at arm's length, a nice story for no one's ears. He had not counted on a Marine who had already pulled the founding charter out of the archive. Walter, told gently by someone that perhaps it was all best left in the past, that the Academy wasn't sure it could verify his role, felt the old erasure settle over him one more time. The familiar understanding that he would be forgotten again, that an old man's truth would never weigh against an institution's preferred story. For a moment, even Walter Briggs, who had trained dogs that saved lives, prepared to simply go home on his 2 buses and disappear back into his solitude, because that was the only thing the world had left him to do. But Cole was already moving, because 13 years had taught a man named Cole Hayes to be in the room before the thing he was guarding against could do its quiet work. The confrontation came at the Academy's board meeting, head of the fundraising gala, where Wade Vance had planned to keep the founding story tidy and Walter Briggs safely absent, and where Cole walked in instead with Carol from records, the founding charter in hand, and Walter Briggs himself in his good cap with Titan at his side. Titan walked into that boardroom and crossed straight to sit at Walter's feet, and when Vance began to speak, the dog turned and fixed him with a steady, unblinking stare, 90 pounds of the Academy's own best work plainly declaring where it stood. The room had gone quiet, not silent, quiet, the kind of unnatural drop in sound that trained people notice immediately. Cole stepped forward, slow, and nobody moved. "Before anybody decides, Mr. Briggs is a confused old man with an exaggerated story," Cole said. "You should all know what's actually in your own archive." Vance's polished calm was already hardening. "This is a board matter regarding our institutional history and our donor presentation. You are a trainer, not a historian, and we cannot simply insert unverified personal claims into the Academy's official story on the word of one elderly visitor. With respect to the gentleman, who exactly are you to bring this here?" "Gunnery Sergeant Cole Hayes," Cole said, and his voice never rose. "United States Marine Corps, 13 years, 3 deployments. 8 of those years I handled dogs trained on methods I now know came from him. He nodded at Walter. So no, I don't much care about the donor presentation. But I'll tell you who this is, Walter Briggs, United States Marine, Korea. One of the men who built the American War Dog program with his own hands, and the man who personally trained the founders of this academy. The temperament you sell to your donors, the bloodline in every dog that graduated last week, the methods I use in your own hall, they trace back to him. He didn't exaggerate his role. You forgot it. You let the man who started all of this ride 2 buses to sit alone in your back row. You can't simply. This is the founding charter, Carol said, stepping forward and laying the old document on the table, her voice shaking. From our own archive. Walter Briggs is named in it. The founder's dedication is to the man who taught them. I filed it away 30 years ago and we all forgot it was there. She set it down. 8 dogs remembered him before any of us did. I'm done forgetting. Vance's composure cracked. This is the optics of this, the campaign. You can't just rewrite, I won't have the Academy's story. This isn't over, Vance tried. But the words came out smaller than the brand had ever let them come. It was over. He just hadn't caught up to it yet. The board read the charter, and the lineage records, and the dedication in their own founding documents, and the room turned all at once, the way the dogs had turned, toward the old man in the cap. Wade Vance's tidy, donor-friendly history collapsed under the weight of the Academy's own archive, and his quiet campaign to keep a founder forgotten became, in front of the whole board, the thing he was answering for. He was, in time, removed from his stewardship of an institution whose history he'd been willing to erase for a brochure. A board member near the window covered her mouth with her hand. Nobody spoke for a long time after that. Cole didn't watch the board deal with Vance. He'd turned to Walter Briggs, who sat with one hand buried in Titan's fur, his eyes shining, finally, after all the forgetting, seen. Why'd you come alone? Cole asked gently. You could have called the Academy, told them who you were. Walter shook his head, a small, dignified motion. A man doesn't go demanding to be remembered, son. That's not how it's done. He looked down at the dog leaning against his knee. I just wanted to see the dogs once more. Didn't think anybody'd know me. His voice caught. But they knew me. The dogs knew me. 8 of them I never met, and they knew me. It's in their blood, Cole said quietly, his hand on Titan's back beside the old man's. Everything you gave, sir, it's still in them. You never left this place. We just forgot to look. The dogs never did. 8 months later, the late autumn sun came down warm and gold over the grounds of the Academy outside Cedar Grove, the Blue Ridge gone amber and rust on the horizon, the training fields bright in the slanting light. Cole sat on a bench by the main hall with a cup of coffee, his bad hip stretched out long, and Carol from Records sat beside him with a thermos of tea, and neither of them said much because they didn't need to. Out on the field, an 87-year-old Marine sat in a comfortable chair set out just for him, watching a class of young dogs train, and a black and amber German shepherd named Titan lay in the grass at his feet in the sun, lifting his head every time the old man spoke, tail moving slow and easy. The reckoning had reached past one forgotten name. The Academy, shamed and then moved by its own history, had restored Walter Briggs to his rightful place in its story. A permanent dedication in the main hall now bore his name and his photograph, and the truth of what he'd given, where every future class and every donor would see it. Wade Vance's campaign of polite erasure was undone, and Walter himself had been made, formally, the Academy's founder-in-residence and honorary trainer, a title that meant a car came for him now. Instead of 2 buses, that meant young handlers sat at his feet to learn the old methods from the source. That meant the man who had built it all was no longer alone in the only world that had ever been his. Titan had been retired from active placement and given, officially, to Walter Briggs, or perhaps Walter to Titan. With dogs like that, it is never quite clear who has adopted whom. The young dog lived with the old man now, the 2 of them inseparable, the lineage and its source united at last. Cole still trained the Academy's dogs. The metal in his hip still woke him on cold mornings. But on the first Saturday of every month, and most days between, he drove out to bring Walter to the field, and an old Marine raised a hand from his chair, and a young dog rose to meet the truck, and a man who had spent years not knowing what he was for found he had finally quietly worked it out. Titan no longer broke from a line to cross a room toward Walter. He simply never left the old man's side now, and his tail never quite stopped the whole time the 2 of them sat in the sun. Peace had arrived. The story was over. Sometimes miracles don't arrive as thunder from the sky. Sometimes they happen when every dog in a crowded room turns at once toward a forgotten old Man in the back row, and a single person is humble enough to ask why. The world isn't saved by superheroes. It's saved by ordinary people who turn around and finally see the ones who've been let slip out of the story, and by animals who carry a loyalty and a memory written into their very blood that human language has never been quite able to hold. God does not always keep the world from forgetting the people who gave it the most. That forgetting is one of the quieter cruelties of a busy and ungrateful age. But sometimes he arranges things so that what men forget, something more faithful remembers. And on the right spring morning, 8 dogs who had never met an old Marine will turn as one toward the man their whole line came from, and refuse to look away until the humans in the room remember too. Walter Briggs rode 2 buses to sit alone in a back row, because he believed he had been forgotten by the very world he'd built, and asked for nothing more than to watch the dogs one last time. He was almost right about the forgetting. The miracle wasn't that an institution finally corrected its history, though it did. It was that the loyalty he'd spent his life breeding into those dogs reached across decades and bloodlines to find him in his loneliest hour, and that when 8 dogs turned to honor a man the world had let slip away, there was one person there who understood that the only right thing to do was turn with them. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded to turn around and see the ones the world has forgotten before it's too late to thank them. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And tell us, have you ever seen someone remembered just in time? Or been the one who finally recognized a person everyone else overlooked? Your story may be the one that reminds another person to look to the back row. And if you believe in stories of service, loyalty, and the quiet courage of ordinary people, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. May God bless you, protect your family, bring peace to your home, and watch over every forgotten veteran sitting alone in a back row somewhere tonight, and every faithful dog whose blood still remembers the hand that first believed in it.